This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is Charlie Chaplin's 1931 film, City Lights, Why It's a Great Film. I have Chuck Mayland and Jill Franks, and they will be discussing this when we return. The subject is Charlie Chaplin's 1931 film, City Lights. I have Chuck Mayland and Jill Franks to discuss why it's a great film. I like to give my participant a minute or two to give a brief précis on who they are and what they like about the film. So let me start with Chuck on the left. Chuck, if you could just give a little précis about who you are and why the film you think is worth viewing by modern audiences.
Yeah, Dan, thanks for inviting me. I'm a film teacher and a scholar who has taught at the University of Tennessee for many years. I just recently retired, but I got interested in Chaplin and his films in 1971 when his films were re-released in the United States for the first time in a long time. And in the fall of 71 and early 72, I got to see all of his United Artists features and many of his first national features in a very compressed period of time. And it was actually a great way to see how an artist's films evolved through his career. And ever since that time, I've been interested in Chaplin's films. And I think City Lights is maybe his best, or certainly one of his two best films. So that's a little background on me.
How about you, Jill, if you could give a background about yourself and also opening thoughts on the film?
Sure. Thank you for having us, Dan. I started a film studies program at my Tennessee University, but I left there in 2020. I came back home to Western Massachusetts, where I'm now teaching film and literature at UMass. And 3 years ago, I had a sabbatical here, and I wrote a book on Charlie Chaplin and Woody Allen. I was interested in putting them into context of pre-World War II and post-World War II, or modernism and postmodernism, and seeing what I called Woody's verbal slapstick compared to Charlie. To me, he's the best. Charlie's the best physical slapstick that exists. And so I wrote that book, and I did it by pairing, surprisingly, films by each auteur that had the same theme. So it makes you wonder if, like, in this type of comedy, there is a limited number of plots, or whether two of them just think alike. And it's really interesting to me that Woody liked Charlie better than Buster Keaton, and he said he felt that little bit of humanness in Charlie that, in contrast, Buster Keaton was just like a cool brilliance, she said. This particular movie, I was so relieved to hear Chuck say that maybe it's one of his two favorites, because for me, my favorites are Modern Times and The Great Dictator, and I also love Limelight. So you can see I like the talkies better. But I think that City Lights, for the silence, is the best, and he had reached the peak of his abilities in silent film. And it has the love story that he's very proud of. Of course, Charlie says that it's his favorite film of his own of all time. And I think that's because he was able to give a little more vulnerability in terms of that famous trope that he has, the tramp is going to be rejected in love, but at the end of this film, City Lights, he may be accepted. We just don't know.
Yeah, I'm actually going to do Woody Allen Stardust Memories over the course of doing 40 or so these film shows. So maybe if you are a fan of Stardust Memories, I can have you back. But I wanted to pick up on what you said, because I was going to go there next myself. I am 56, and I was born in 1965. I grew up in New York City, and there was a television show called The Joe Franklin Show. It was an interview show, and he often had old clips from then, the ancient silences back in the 70s. And as a young kid in the 70s, after Dick Cavett went off the air, I would watch the Joe Franklin Show and see Fatty Arbuckle and Chaplin and Lloyd and Keaton and all of them. And even as a kid, I absolutely agree with what you said, that Alan said, is that Chaplin was simply superior. I think in the last couple of decades, it's become fashionable to slag on him, saying, oh, he was such a sentimentalist and this and that. And, Harold Lloyd was great with all the great thrill stunts, and Buster Keaton, was great. But I recently rewatched about a year ago The General by Buster Keaton. and there's really no story. It's just one thrill. When you talk about Chaplin's best, and we'll stick with the silent films as the best comparison. Once he started making his feature length films, there were characterizations. There were those little moments where you could recognize yourself in Chaplin the way you couldn't in Keaton, the great stone face, and you couldn't even in the Everyman of Harold Lloyd. And I love Harold Lloyd, and I love Keaton, but Chaplin is on a level above. So before we start on the film, let me just start with you, Jill. I take it, agree with both me and Alan. Then, what do you think separates Chaplin from his main rivals?
Well, okay, maybe I'm saying this as a woman, but like he's wicked handsome. And I just wrote something about city lights to prepare myself, and I said something that I've not seen written anywhere else, but maybe we'll see what you two think. The only thing that would break this kind of classic handsome look on his face, and I got the best photograph of him for my cover. See, that's the best photograph of Charlie Chaplin, like a close up anyway. But he does have an overbite, and it looks worse in the famous final shot in City Lights for some reason, because I think there's like some black in between his teeth. It might be like the film stock. And so I think that why he has his hand up there in that shot is maybe the self-consciousness about the teeth. But so there's that, and I know that's rather frivolous. It's lookless to say that, but you know, when you said, Dan, that his structure of his films was better than Keaton's, I think that's something he worked so hard on. But I think he falls short in things like Modern Times and The Great Dictator because it has that bad ending. I think that because he didn't have an education, it maybe was challenging to Charlie to come up with a perfect narrative unity and coherence. But I think that he achieves that in City Lights and maybe Limelight better than any other film. Certainly, he has more relatability than Keaton. And Harold Lloyd, I mean, Harold Lloyd with the glasses and the slick back hair, I don't think he's a universal recognizability with that. It's not that he looks intellectual exactly, although the glasses are certainly those round owlish ones. But I think in terms of movement and grace, I think that Charlie wins the contest with the competitors right there. And there's just something, I realized today, I'm thinking about him so hard, that what it is I'm a woman, but I can relate to him because he has that ability to bounce back to any insult. And he's not macho, but at the same time, he is completely self-confident. But I think that his short stature helps, I think, women to relate to him. And I think he's lovable, not for muscles or anything, although he's very, very toned, you know, and that shows in the boxing scene of City Lights. He's very, very fit. But he takes care of himself. There's something so very appealing about his aura, if I could say.
Before I go on to Chuck, let me just ask you a question, because I think City Lights is his best film overall in the oeuvre, silent or not. But the film that he did right before that, I think, is very underrated. I think it has a terrific end too, The Circus, and it's usually overlooked in his canon. But the ending there, where they all pull up and he's there and he just walks off as the tramp, to me that's what's the great Bergman film with The Circus? It seems almost like a prequel to that. Just off the top of my head, what is your opinion on The Circus? I think it's his great neglected film.
You're asking Chuck, right?
No, I'm asking you, and then I'll go to Chuck.
Oh, I love The Circus. It made my book. I compared it to Woody Allen's, what's it called, Shadows and Fog, because there's a circus in that. No, I love The Circus. I was thinking about, you know, the tramp's relative chances of getting the girl at the end in Gold Rush and The Circus and City Lights, and he does something that's so altruistic in The Circus, as he does also in City Lights, which is to give up the girl who came to find him at his campsite and would have run off with him. So that's very lovely. But the slapstick in the circus has got really some peak moments. And my favorite is, of course, the tightrope with monkeys. And I think that's true with Modern Times too. It has the machine scenes that as some of the best slapstick. Whereas in City Lights, I think the slapstick is not as great, but that's compensated by the perfect narrative structure of alternating between the millionaire story and the blind girl story.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to. I'm going to go to Chuck in a second, but my favorite scene is actually the one where he runs into the lion's cage, and people don't realize that that's one of the earliest scenes where the same scene is spliced together at different times. He's not in the cage with the lion, actually. That's one of the early special effects scenes of all time. But let me start with you, Chuck. First, let me just ask you, Chaplin versus his, let's call it the two main competitors, Lloyd and Keaton. Do you agree with me and Jill that Charlie has that pathos, there's a humanity that's lacking in the other two? And then any comments you want on the circus?
Yeah. I guess what I'd say is Lloyd, I think, was much more kind of middle class, everyman hero, and so it's not a surprise to me that he actually sold more tickets in the 20s than Chaplin did. That was partly because he was more productive. You know, he made a couple features a year, but it was that sort of middle class go-getter kind of persona that he played that I think was attractive to audiences. And then also he did have these, you know, he was good at setting up gags. Sometimes these gags where he's you know, hanging from a clock in the top of a building and so on. I think that was a good bit of the appeal there. Keaton, I love Keaton too, but for very different reasons than Chaplin. I think he is so good at constructing gags using the interaction between the set and the Buster Keaton character, and the fact that face is so inexpressive.
Yeah.
You know, there's this chaos going on around him, and he just works his way through it. I'm thinking of like in a movie like 1 Week, where a wall falls down behind him, and it doesn't hit him because the window goes right through. And I used to tell my students, I don't laugh that much at Keaton films, but a lot of times I will go, oh, you know, it's amazing, you know. But there's not a lot of laughter for me in the Keaton films. To me, Chaplin is such a masterful performer. Jill sort of alluded to it. He's graceful. He's like a dancer at times. I think of Keaton as much more of an athlete, like a ball player. And I understand that when you would make films between shots, they would play baseball. He was more of an athlete. But Chaplin is so graceful, not only with his body, but with his hands, and so expressive with his face. And I think, to me, there's some just tremendous moments in City Lights, like in the scene where he brings the money to the blind girl.
Yeah.
And she says, "Will I see you again?" And you have that medium close-up of him standing by the door, just thinking, do I want her to see me?
Yeah.
You know, it sets up the end, but just the expression that he has on his face there is just quite brilliant acting. And then we can think of many other Chaplin films, you know, where he's being impish, or he's being, you know, infatuated, in love with one of the characters, or when he's being kind of scurrilous. You know, his face expresses that, and I think that plays a great role in getting us to feel such a broad range of human emotions when watching his movies, especially in the later movies, later silent movies like City Lights. To me, one of the reasons that Chaplin lasted so long, his career lasted so long, is that not only did he evolve as a filmmaker, but also he takes us through a broader range of human emotions than either Lloyd or Keaton do, however good their films are in other reasons. So I guess that's what I'd say about Chaplin.
Yeah, let me just ask, because while we were speaking, I was thinking, Keaton, things happen to him, whereas the Tramp makes things happen for good or worse. And a lot of the things that happen to the Tramp are emotional things that come out of the character trying to get status or get ahead in the world, whereas with Keaton it's all mechanical, and it's brilliant. Like, I think the Electric House is my favorite Keaton short, and it's for the 1920s. It's just a brilliantly conceived series of events that happen to him.
Yeah.
But again, there's no moment like the Dance of the Rolls, in whatchamacallit. What
Gold
is
Rush.
Gold Rush? Yeah. And let me just, before we go on and talk about the film proper that we're here to discuss, any comments about what I said about the circus? I think it's his great neglected film.
Yeah, I wonder if he maybe didn't publicize it as well as his other films because he was going through so many other things. I think that might have been one of the reasons that the circus didn't initially get such a good reputation. And I think it's a really wonderful film. In fact, again, I think he was trying out some of those scenes of pathos that he achieved even better in City Lights. Like, if you remember that scene in the circus where he overhears Myrna talking about how she's in love with Rex, and he overhears it, and it's heartbreaking to him, and you see that expressed in his face. Very similar to some of the things that we'll feel in Pathos in City Lights. So, and then I'm with Jill. That scene on the tightrope with the monkeys. That's a very funny scene. And also, I think it's Chaplin. That movie too. Chaplin is trying out some thematic things in a more ambitious way than he had done in some of his earlier slapstick, like the way that he uses the clowns in the circus. When they try to make people funny, make people laugh, they aren't funny.
Yeah.
But spontaneously, when Charlie does something, that's funny. So I think he's wrestling with ideas with what is comedy, and how does comedy happen? And I think it's an interesting film in a number of ways. And I agree too with that ending where he's self-sacrificial there. It's sort of heartbreaking, and he wants Myrna to go off with Rex because he feels she will be happier with him. But then he's alone and isolated. But even at the end of the film, if you remember that very last shot, he's walking away from the camera and he does that little dance with his feet. And he's, back to what Jill said, he's a resilient character too. He can fight his way through disappointment and so on. And that's something we all, I guess, in the middle of this pandemic, we could all appreciate some resilience. So that's one thing that Charlie always had in spades, I think.
So let's talk about the opening of the film. And before I do that, it's often said that this is his last silent film, although in some versions you hear sort of the Charlie Brown wah, wah, wah kind of thing when people are talking. Yeah. So was that original, the wah, wah, wahs, was that intended, or was that added in some versions of the film?
Yeah, no, that was there. Chaplin wrestled a long time because when he was shooting that film, talkies had taken over the film industry.
Yeah.
Like Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, who were two of his other owners of United Artists. They made their first talking film, Taming of the Shrew. It came out in October of 1929. And Chaplin was kind of in the middle of shooting City Lights then. And I even saw some production stills of recording instruments on his set. So early on in the production, he was even toying with the idea of maybe having dialogue. But then he finally decided, and I think he had good reasons to do so. He finally decided that he would not have dialogue because that at least half of the revenue of his films came from foreign rentals, and as soon as you start speaking English, then you got to start dubbing into other languages or subtitling or doing things like that. And I mean, he was so successful as a pantomime artist, he decided to go ahead with that. But just as much, it's not a silent film. It's a sound film with, and it was planned as a sound film with music and sound effects, but no dialogue. So the wah 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 or the whistles, you know, in that whistle scene, when he calls the taxi, and calls the dogs, and so on. That was in the plans. And to me, that soundtrack of City Lights, it's the first time that Chaplin worked with a composer to do his own score for a movie, and you know, that was there when the film was released. They had written that score in October and November and December of 1930 and recorded it at the very end of December and the start of January. So to me, that's crucial to the overall effect of the film too, especially in that last scene. The pitch of emotion that we feel in that last scene, where you know, she finds out who he is. I think the score plays a real big role in that. So yeah, it's really a transitional film, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a silent film, you know, in all intents and purposes, but then it has that musical score and the sound effects, and that was original to the film.
Jill, how about the other lead, Virginia Cheryl? I've read and seen, you know, information on that she was not the original choice, and that even he was not satisfied at the end. But I guess the money men or whatnot who were behind the film said, you know, he has to go with her. Is there a story there that you know of?
Sure, and Chuck knows it well too. I mean, it's a really interesting story. He met her at a boxing match. Boxing was so popular back then, and I guess she was seated near him, and he could see that her eyes were like vacuous, like because she was not wearing her glasses because she was myopic but wanted to be pretty. So he thought this was what he called it was a blind look without being offensive. So he hired her, and she had absolutely no experience, and I guess she didn't realize you had to worship the master. And like, she asked him one day if she could leave 5 minutes early to go get her hair done, and he blew up. The roof came off his head. But I heard two different stories about the firing. So he fired her then. One was that she came back 5 minutes late for lunch, and the other was that she asked to leave early. The late for lunch story is very feasible to me because you have the tramp coming back late for lunch and getting fired at the street cleaning concern. But he worked with Georgia Hale then for a while. And there's a still of her in Chuck's book doing the final scene with, she's holding the flower. And I think you say, Chuck, you know, you're very glad that he went back to Virginia Cheryl. I agree with that. There's something about Virginia's blonde good looks and her youth and her, I think she has really strong ability. Because in the final scene, most critics talk about Charlie's acting. Maybe that's because Charlie says he's most fond of that shot of himself of all his shots. He wasn't used to close-ups, so it's a shot he remembers well. But I think in those last 58 seconds that she's doing an awfully good job, too, because she's not overacting. And the camera is close enough that she can be very, very subtle with her expressions, which she has to capture, not overwhelmed with gratitude to him for paying for her operation, but neither should she show, like, she shouldn't show that he's dirty and poor too much. She shouldn't be shocked. She shouldn't be overwhelmed with gratitude. It's got to be right in the middle. And I just read today, or I maybe listened to the Jeffrey Vance commentary on the DVD, that those tears that you see, indeed they are there, but they're glycerin drops. So, you know, I think that a non-actress like that doesn't know how to create tears. So their working relationship was the worst he ever had with a romantic lead. So it's really doubly ironic that they were the best lovers or had the most romantic. all the movie.
So Jill, the film opens with the Chaplin tramp character snoozing in the bosom of a statue that's about to be unveiled, and it's unveiled, and it's an interesting thing because it almost, I mean, if it had started just 30 seconds later, it almost starts in medias res there. The tramp is known from the other film, but even if you don't know the tramp, it's a good way to start a film with this kind of gag. What is your opinion of the opening?
I don't know. I think you're right, Dan, to say if that's what you meant. It actually could have started after the speeches because there's something awkward about the speeches. Even, you notice the wealthy woman cuts the ribbon, and then awkwardly, that's not what lifts the canvas off the statue, because then it's like a tent, and you can see all the police pulling it off in the back. But as soon as he gets his butt on the sword, we're in good Chaplin territory, and the pace is just right because there's 3 figures in the statue, and he's going to use each one. And I remember researching for my book, and someone said that Chaplin had a kind of analogy to his humor, and that being with the pants cut on the sword was one of his examples. And then I picked it up in terms of the tightrope scene in the circus. But, to end with the thumbing nose with the third statue is brilliant. And if you think of it, he had to have created the statue with that in mind, that it was going to come up to doing that. Really cute when he puts his butt on the man's head, because Charlie likes to play with homosexuality or people's homophobia a lot. And the kazoo talking of the mayor and the other people is good. I've seen so many times that it lost its freshness to me, but it does make the point that all the in-crowd knows when they're watching it contemporaneously with it coming out and now, which is that you thought I would do talking. I'm not going to do talking because this is how bad talking sounds on bad equipment. Yeah. And also at the same time, so it's like in literature, this would be like an overdetermined metaphor, because at the same time as it's saying that, it's saying we don't need to hear the words because it's very empty speech. You say the same thing at all ribbon cuttings. It doesn't mean anything.
Just bloviations. Chuck, what do you think of the opening?
Yeah, I would agree with Jill there that, it seems to me that scene is in there largely just to introduce a tramp character, and also for Chaplin to make the point that talking movies aren't that great. He's making fun of talk right from the very beginning of the film. So it's self-reflexive in a way that's pretty sophisticated, and it's something that kept up with modern times. Because if you remember, in modern times there is some dialogue, but it's always expressed only through it's mass mediated. Like the factory owner has a TV of himself in the bathroom that calls the tramp back to work. So Chaplin was, I thought, really quite clear and sophisticated in how he responded to sound. And in City Lights, that's the first thing he does, right? Is to sort of make fun of, as you say, the bloviations of public figures in events like that. And then if you look at that statue, it is the most ridiculous statue. The 3 figures. One of them is a figure of a person lying down, holding a sword up in the air. Clearly designed for the tramp to do the various gags. And it's called they call the statue Peace and Prosperity, but what's that sword doing there? If that's the case. So it's a clever thing, but it also crucially sets up the tramp as an outsider, right? As someone, he's sleeping there at night. He's homeless, and so here's these public figures celebrating the dedication of this statue, and they're clearly of a different social class and so on than the tramp who's homeless, and that helps. Doesn't that kind of help set up then the way the film goes back and forth between the millionaire and the flower girl, whose economic circumstances are very, very different, and whose living circumstances are very different. So that scene, and then the next scene where he's going through the town and goes in front of the art museum store and so on. It kind of sets him up as a marginalized figure who's surviving but not thriving in this environment.
Well, Chuck, let me just ask you, and then I'll go to Jill. The tramp is a character that is, in a sense, a transcendent character that arcs over most of his film appearances. Early on in the shorts, though, the tramp was much more nasty, and he could be more brutal. He had, and the reason I bring it up is because there's the scene with the newsboys with the pea shooters who are, and it seems that this iteration of the tramp, sort of like every Godzilla film is a different Godzilla. This iteration of the tramp is probably the weakest in terms of, because he's being bullied by 12 or 13-year-old boys. Yeah. I mean, if you go just back one film in the circus, it takes some big, strong circus guys to bully him. Yeah. In other iterations, it's a big Yukon mountaineer that'll bully him. But here, he's reduced to taking it from these two little snots. So what about this iteration of the tramp? Is this sort of like what dramatic purpose do you think it serves to have?
I think that's a good point. I mean, he's really marginalized, and he's made fun of even by these young boys, and I think that's one thing that can help intensify the pathos in the film. The feelings of sadness you feel for him, and the way you can empathize with him because of the situation he's in. That's an initial setup that is intensified in that last scene in the film when he gets out of the jail, where I can't remember in any of his films seeing him in such tattered clothing in that very last scene, but we start setting that up right from the beginning, and in the interaction with the newsboys. So, I think he calls it a comedy romance in pantomime, and I think he was really trying to figure out how you could do that romance in an engaging way, still have comedy, but also just have the most intense pathos. And one way of doing that is by making the character really kind of pathetic almost from the beginning of the film.
Jill, what is your take upon this iteration of the tramp in this film?
I agree with Chuck that he's more vulnerable, and I was thinking about the gender question that I brought up in a few minutes ago. I think that vulnerability makes him more appealing, perhaps, to a female audience, or really both gender audience, or the many, many, many genders of the world audience. What Chuck was just saying about blending, you didn't use the word, Chuck, but having those two genres to blend, even his title signals that's what he's going to, pantomime plus romance. And I have to admit, I read this. I didn't necessarily think of it, but sometimes you don't know which were your thoughts or which you read. But he will balance the comedy and pathos in this by cutting into a comedy scene with pathos, and then cutting into a pathos scene with comedy. And maybe the two best examples are when he's in the boxing ring, and it's been like about 3 rounds, and he's half conscious. And they are rubbing him, and they're rubbing down his pants. It's so funny, and it's so pre-sex on movies. So what that audience is thinking is maybe not much more innocent than what we're thinking, because the rubber, the massage guy, turns into Virginia Cherub. momentarily, and then he's stroking her hand and kissing it. So he brings, the second plot into this more manly plot because he's boxing. And then in reverse, when he's doing pathos because she just sold him his first flower and thinks he's a millionaire, and he tiptoes away, but then tiptoes back to spy on her. And she goes over to the running fountain and fills a pail, and she's actually just rinsing the pail, so she throws it out of space.
Yeah.
And so all that scene, whatever 4 minutes or whatever, has built up incredible love because they have a long. Charlie's gazing into her eyes, and then cuts with this slapstick.
That's when I teach that film. That always gets one of the biggest laughs too, when he gets it right after it's been very tender moment. It's been very, very tender and complicated, and then he undercuts it with humor.
Yeah.
Before he actually sees the flower girl, there's one great gag scene with the elevator that comes up in the sidewalk when he's looking at the nude statue in the window. And to me, that's, I guess, the really great physical gag in the whole film there. And I've seen clips of him when he was not in the tramp costume, where they're showing him practicing and doing the little 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's almost like a little waltz going back there. Any comments on that particular scene, the virtuoso aspect of just the skill to do that?
I'd say, Chaplin was good at figuring out things. First of all, at rehearsing, he was good at rehearsing. So that would take some very careful rehearsing, I think. But I think that's because it creates suspense, doesn't it? When you're watching the film, oh no, he's going to fall backwards into that hole. But another thing that I think it does is that scene ends with him, scolding the workman who's down beneath the ground, scolding the workman, and then it comes up and it turns out that guy's like a head and a half taller than him. And it's he's Jill talks about his resilience. He knows, it's not. I'm not going to get in a fight with this guy, so he tips his hat and walks off. But it sets up too that vulnerability that he has at the start of the movie. He's physically not strong, socially he's not, and economically he's not strong, and it sets up a contrast between what we would see in his earlier films, Eric Campbell, a big gargantuan guy, being able to threaten him, and Chaplin being a kind of diminutive but resilient character. I think I can't speak for women, but I think that might be one reason why Chaplin can be kind of interesting to women characters, because he's not all powerful and domineering or things like that. I remember Joan Mellon wrote a nice book about male sexual stereotypes in movies, and it's called Big Bad Wolves, because that's oftentimes, the Clint Eastwood, Arnold Schwarzenegger, John Wayne kind of stereotype. But Chaplin's image is really quite different from that. And it's smaller physically, not domineering of people, but, at least in the films from the 20s on, kind of yearning, reaching out for relationships, positive, loving relationships with other people. So seeing him small in contrast to that big guy, it's both funny, because he walks off, and the scene is suspenseful because he almost tumbles into the hole, just like when he's skating blindfolded in modern times, and we think he's going to fall over into this, from the second floor of the department store. Creates that, but again, it emphasizes his smallness and his lack of power, you might say, but also his smartness and his resilience.
Jill, do you have any comment on that particular scene?
Well, it's funny because it's supposed to be showing us that the tramp has a sexuality to him, a lust, but I don't feel it in that scene as much as I do in the massage getting myself on the belly. I like the scene. I don't find it my favorite slapstick of the whole movie though, but it is interesting, the sequence in which it comes, because it, like you mentioned, it does come right after he gets the. No. It's before he gets the water thrown. So it's the second. Okay, so there's the statue, and then there's the art store, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
really an introduction to his character. I don't know. I'm glad to see him having a sexual side without it being looking at actual women, so it's not perverted, but it's just like the whole trope of pretending he's an art connoisseur while he just likes to talk.
Hmm.
And by the way, that same statue was in his Woman of Paris, like 7 years before.
Oh yeah.
It's a good statue.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting too how the man statue on the horse is dwarfed compared to the woman. It's just up on a pedestal.
Yeah.
So when he meets the blind girl, the other major trope of the film, I think, has to do with the millionaire and the riches. And the film started filming, from what I'm reading, in December of 2018, and it filmed through September of 1930. So, I mean, the film actually goes from the Jazz Age to the Great Depression. And, it seems, do you think there's any implicit comment about the society at large, with the blind girl mistaking the sound of what's clearly a rich guy, and she can obviously hear that there's a chauffeured limousine. That's where she gets the idea that Chaplin, the tramp, is a rich guy. And then later he befriends an actual millionaire who's a raging drunkard who wants to kill himself, and then he doesn't know Chaplin. So what are any of the implicit critiques of American society at that time, Jill?
Well, I think it's more a movie about the Jazz Age, especially. I think that's Charleston. They're doing at both the nightclub and the Millionaire's Party at home. Than it is about the Depression, because the T-shaped set where vehicles are going fast and furious. Everyone is dressed up, and it's undercranked, so they're all like filled with energy, like spending energy. So I don't get any intimations of the Depression from this film. He had written it, like, I think in 27. Of course, his scripts are always improvisational too. So in any event, he's going to make up for all that in modern times, which is directly addressing the Depression.
Chuck, what's your take on, is there any kind of critique that you find of the American system, capitalism in that day? Or?
Yeah, I do think it is that, but I think I'd agree with Jill. It's more a critique of the Jazz Age in the 20s. It's more like the critique that we might make of the F. Scott Fitzgerald's drunken excesses in the 1920s. To me, I think there's a kind of submerged autobiography in the circus that's not direct autobiography. Like, if you think of someone like F. Scott Fitzgerald, whose fiction was quite autobiographical, like in a novel like Tender as the Night, it's very thinly veiled autobiography about his relationship with, about F. Scott Fitzgerald's relationship with Zelda after she was hospitalized. But Chaplin is such an interesting person to me, because he grew up sometimes in pretty dire poverty, and certainly instability when he was a young man, and a boy and a young man. And then after he became this famous movie star, almost overnight, over a period of 3 or 4 years, then he became enormously wealthy. And he lived most of the 1920s as a celebrity that people, really wanted to see. And he could go to these parties, and he'd be the center of attention at the party. So I think he saw and interacted with people who were very wealthy, some of whose lives were not happy lives at all, even though they had all the wealth that they wanted. And Jeffrey Vance and I think David Robinson both talk about his friend named Ralph Barton, who was a photographer, a very wealthy guy, who was also very unhappy in his relationships with other people, and who committed suicide while City Lights was being made. And also, I think there's another dimension of submerged autobiography in the film. Chaplin had just gone through his second divorce. He had been very unsuccessful in his relationships with women. And I think partly because of his obsession with his work and his inability to really care for the two women, the first two women that he married. And if you remember, when we first see the millionaire, when he gets back to his home, we learn that he has just been separated from his wife, and he picks up that picture of his wife and just throws it aside. And so I think there's a little bit even of Chaplin in the millionaire, or at least Chaplin's understanding of the disdain that you might have for a very wealthy lifestyle. And critics have also written about, it's interesting that in the film, the tramp wants to really help a blind woman, a woman whose physical handicap makes it hard for her to get along well, because and these critics have linked the blind girl with Chaplin's mother, who passed away during the production of the film in August of 1928. She passed away, and it hit Chaplin very hard because his mother, had been a music hall singer who had lost her voice, and then who lived much of her adult life with mental instability, in and out of institutions. And there were certain times when Chaplin was a young man, surviving himself, when he couldn't really help out his mother. He wasn't financially secure enough to do that, and I think that pained him. It was traumatized him as a boy and as a young man. And so when his mother passed away during the shooting of this film, I think some of the feelings he felt about the tramp trying to help this person who is infirm in some ways is a kind of submerged autobiographical connection to his own feelings about his inability to help his mother and his desire to help his mother. And it's interesting that personal death happened during City Lights, much like the birth of Chaplin's first son in 1920 happened just as he was starting to write The Kid.
Yeah.
So I think these things that he feels deeply about work themselves in indirect ways into the feelings of his movies.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at Chaplin, because I've read numerous times that Chaplin in the 1920s was the most recognizable human being that ever lived to that point. Everyone you could be in Manchuria, you could be in South Africa, you could be in Uruguay. You knew who the tramp was. At least his character was the most recognizable.
Yeah.
And that he had these personal failings, yet he was this. I mean, he was a true superstar, maybe the first superstar that there ever was in mass media. So one of these days, maybe I'll do a Chaplin psychological show. But let me just talk then about the millionaire character played by Harry Myers. Jill, do you have any? Do you want to talk about the character or the actor of Harry Myers and the role he plays in the film?
Sure. Well, I mean, just one of the fun facts about, because I'm always interested in who was fired on the set. There's this Australian guy, Claude somebody, that was fired in the millionaire part because he wouldn't jump in that water, which was supposed to be the river of the unnamed city, but Charlie had filled some kind of pool in it. And he said, "Can we wait till the sun's up higher and that water will be warmed up?" So Charlie just fired him. But then Harry Myers he had worked with before, and vaudeville characters know very much how to be in pain in their bodies. I mean, I remember famously that Buster Keaton was dragged across the stage. Do you remember this, Chuck? By his father in early vaudeville?
Yeah.
By hair or something like this, and then just thrown away. So I think Harry Myers is great. And I was thinking, while Chuck talked about the personal life at the time of the making, and with Hannah, I was thinking too that Charlie couldn't visit her at Glendale very often because he would get all freaked out. He may have felt that he could catch her insanity or that he had inherited it. And he would get too depressed by these visits to be able to work well. So he kept it limited. At the same time, that didn't mean he didn't love her. He loved her very much. And so I was thinking that maybe that fear of insanity went into the character of the millionaire that Charlie also gets to save, the way that he gets to save the blind girl because the millionaire wants to kill himself, not once, but twice or three times the same night. The millionaire is very attractive as an actor because he can play it's not really the straight man because he's never standing straight. He's reeling drunk all the time. But he plays a good opposite to Charlie because of the size difference. He's not as much taller as Big Jim as an Eric Kimball, but he's taller and he's big. He's got a big torso and kind of skinny legs type of thing. But he often plays a kind of straight face in the scenes in which they're together, whereas Charlie's, as you were saying, Chuck, is so expressive. And I was watching the Jeffrey Vance commentary today, and at one point he said that Sidney Chaplin, Charlie's brother, started watching Harry Myers acting instead of his brothers and getting very interested in it. And that made me watch him more because one's eyes on a Charlie Chaplin, any frame of his film, are drawn to Charlie Chaplin figure, and he means it that way. He sets it up that way. But the millionaire is okay. One of his greatest things is not just falling in the water, because I think that when Charlie gets ripped into the water by the lasso thing, it's brilliant. He goes sideways. His body goes sideways when he does that. But I think the best thing that Harry Myers does that's funny is all this kissing on Charlie when he's drunk. And then just the fact they end up in bed, that's never explained. But after the party, they do end up in bed. It's a big house, but they end up in the same sort of like double bed. So he may be overlooked in this film because Charlie always gets center stage. And then I think that Virginia pulls a lot of focus too because she's very beautiful.
Yeah. So what basically happens is that the tramp pretends to be the millionaire. The girl ends up getting sick. He takes a couple of jobs. He loses some jobs. The millionaire, whenever he's drunk, gives Charlie whatever he wants. So he gives Charlie, the tramp, money because he wants to save the blind girl, who I think she also might have scarlet fever or something. And, she's going to be very ill. So he takes the money, and then the millionaire comes and sobers up, calls the cops because he thinks that the tramp has stolen from him when it's really, a couple of other burglars that stole from him. And so we get to head towards the denouement where the girl is going to be away for some months, and then Charlie gets hauled off to prison. And it's sort of like one of those 1930s Warner Brothers things, time passes, and he's in prison. He finally gets out, except we don't see the months. I don't think we don't see the months being ripped off of the calendar.
We actually do. We see the calendar.
Oh, we do. Okay.
From January to the fall.
Oh, yeah. So in that whole arc, I mean, it's played for laughs, but there's also kind of a pathos to that too, because no matter what he does, he himself doesn't benefit from it, but he's this giving altruistic figure seemingly, although he really wants the girl, so it's not really true altruism. When we let's just talk about that whole passage of time sequence there, because the millionaire, I don't recall, does the millionaire actually ever admit that he was wrong? No, the millionaire, so I think, disappears after that, right?
Yeah, he goes away for a time, right? He takes that trip. We see the trunk, and he's going to go to Europe for a time, and that's when Charlie has to go out and try to get his job as a street cleaner, right? And then has a boxing match, and after he fails at the boxing match, then the millionaire has come back, and he runs into him again in front of the cabaret. But yeah, I mean. when Charlie finds out about this surgery that the blind girl could have, and the millionaire has gone, and the millionaire has also rejected him because he's sober, then he has to go out and get these jobs. And to me, another one of the really sad moments in the film, amidst the sort of brilliance of the choreography of the boxing match, which I think is Chaplin thought he apparently all through his life he loved that scene. He would insist on watching that if you were watching City Lights, but it's so heartbreaking at the end of that scene because he's got to make this money so that he can pay off the blind girl's rent. Right, he's going to make $50, he thinks, and then he gets knocked out, and we say, no, you've got to get up. Again, when I show that movie with my students, they can't believe it. He's lost that fight, And then he goes back and interacts with, runs into the millionaire again, and the millionaire, fortunately for him, is drunk, so he's generous to Charlie and gives him the money. But yeah, I think to me that's another part of the. Jill was talking earlier about the structural tightness of the film, and the way that he goes back and forth. Charlie goes back and forth between those two worlds of the millionaire and of the flower girl, and the way the mise en scène of the flower girl's apartment contrasts so starkly to the mise en scène of the millionaire's, palatial abode. It really sets up that contrast between the world of money and the world of love, and they're separate worlds in the film. And we're finally at the end of the film, the flower girl is holding up both the flower, emblematic of love, and money, wants to give him a coin. So that's just the payoff for this contrast that's been going on throughout the whole film, I think.
Jill, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I not exactly on that, because that was like a lot of exegesis of the plot. But I do want to say something about Charlie. Something I mentioned earlier, that these auteurs also wrote their own films, and this was hard. As I say, he had no education. But I think one of the winning aspects of City Lights is it has an English majory metaphor to it about blindness that works really well. And it has a binary type, like, okay, so the blind girl can't see what he looks like, but she can see inside him because he's so loving when he visits her, gives her things, and the way he talks to her, and strokes her hand. And then the millionaire is blinded. He can see, but he can't see inside Charlie, or in general, he can't see inside people to know what his actions do to them. And so he creates, Charlie Chaplin, director, creates such suspense in the end, because the big question is whether the girl will be able to ignore the outside look and just think about the inside goodness of the person.
So Jill, you were just talking a second ago in between here, about how to read the ending there with the girl. First, let's talk about the ending. It's odd in a sense because we have the visuals and we have a little bit of sound, but film isn't touch. Yet here we're ending on the sense of touch, and she recognizes him as the so-called millionaire that she built up in her mind from his hands from earlier in the film. So Chuck said that he sees it as a romantic ending. Do you see it as a romantic ending? Or?
Oh, I definitely do. And the way the camera goes from the faces, which is usual, shot, reverse shot, but there's a good one like before the last two shot, reverse shots on the hands. And it's not sexy, but it's very tactile, because Charlie, or Ronald Tothrow lingers on these hands long enough, and she's slowly caressing his, which you've got to think that if it's going to come down to whether she can tolerate him physically or not in order to decide whether she would marry him, it's, these hands being comfortable with each other suggests that, yes, it's really, I was saying during the break, it's really what we, the viewer, bring to this scene that's going to determine what we think will happen after the credits run. So if we've had bad love experiences and people leave us, then we think she'll probably laugh at him if he makes a proposal. But if we're a romantic like Chuck says he is, then we're totally in. We totally think that it's been decided already. And to have that kind of ambiguity, in my book I talk a lot about the ambiguity of modernity, particularly modernist literature, is a real, it's different than the ambiguities of the earlier films where the tramp walks off, like in The Circus, he walks off and he leaves that circle where the piece of the star had been broken from the tent. And that's ambiguous in that, oh, he just lost another love, but we know he's just walking to another adventure. But the end of City Lights, it's an ambiguity that's much broader. Like, I even think of it as Plato's dialogues when in the Symposium they ask, what is love? They ask you to define love. And I think that Charlie hit, as a writer, is hitting all the big philosophical, profound issues about do we love the looks or the inside?
So Chuck, as a romantic, what's your take on the ending?
I think if you look at the movie closely, there's no answer to whether that relationship is going to work, because I think there are some things that suggest that it could. There's some things that suggest that it couldn't. Like a little bit when the flower girl first sees the tramp through the store window, she makes that comment to one of the people in the store, "Oh, I've made a conquest."
Yeah.
Which seems like she is really demeaning this person that she's looking at. But then, you know, there's something warm in her. She says, well, she sees this pathetic person. Remember, he didn't even have a shirt on then, you know, his collar's up, his you know, pants are torn. He really does look pathetic. She first offers him this rose and he doesn't seem to respond. Then she grabs a coin and offers him the coin. And then he starts trying to shuffle off. Like he doesn't want her to know who he is. Isn't that the feeling you get when he starts shuffling off like that? But then she pursues him. And as Jill says, you know, that close-up of the hands is really important, because the previous time we saw them together was the last time when he takes the money to her so that she can get the surgery. And there are 2 or 3 shots there where they touch hands and hold hands. So, I mean, it's a brilliant conception, I think, visual conception in the movie, that she recognizes him not by his voice or not by this or that, but by the touch, because the blind person's touch would probably be especially sensitive. And then the way the music goes, after we get that last close-up shot of Charlie with his hand holding the rose over his mouth with this sort of expectant look in his face, and then we cut to black, then the lower registers of the strings come in, which one could look as a kind of a suggestion that this probably isn't going to work out. This woman's settled pretty well now in her floral shop, you know, and this person that she thinks is a wealthy man is essentially a kind of pathetic bum. So I think he poises it so it is up to us. And you know, I would hope that the generosity and love that he had shown her, that has allowed her to get where she was, would allow her to see inside the goodness inside of him and figure out some way to continue a relationship with him. But I totally give my more cynical students the perspective that, oh, it's sad, but it's not going to work out. But I just love that open ending, because it does thrust it on us, doesn't it? It turns the movie back to us to say, what do you think? You know,
Well,
what do you think and why?
well, I take a middle ground. I think there's love there, but I think it's sort of the agape love. I
Okay.
don't think there's a sexual love because I mean, she as portrayed in the film, you can see she's probably of college age, maybe 25 at the end of the film,
Mm-hmm.
maybe at the most. And the
Mm-hmm.
tramp, even if he were the millionaire, is clearly 15, 20 years older. And
Mm-hmm.
when they're touching the hands, even though there's that recognition, uh, it doesn't seem to me. I mean, I go and think of some of like the later Fellini films where you can see the hands touching in some of the later, say the post Juliet of the Juliet films where you can see how lustful hands are. Their hands, there isn't a sexual
Yeah,
lust there. There's
I
that
agree.
to me. So there's love there, but I think for me, I always took it, even as a child, when I first saw it, that they have something deeper than a sexual relationship possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's just, I don't know if you have any comment on that, either one of you.
Well, I just think of how loving she is to her granny. And so maybe and her granny is not particular. I don't know. This whole hour I've been talking about attractiveness as though I'm some kind of a like looksist person, but her granny's not particularly attractive and very plain. But the flower girl is dedicated to her. So this may mean that she can tolerate Charlie. And if she only knew how he looks in a tux, if you want it to happen, you can imagine them getting together. It's so interesting what you said about Fellini, but I'm thinking, well, yeah, he's Italian, he's going to make hands sexy, and Charlie's an Englishman, and I think one of the things I like about Charlie Chaplin's films is that there's not overt sexuality without it usually turning into a joke right away. He pulls back from it. Whereas in Woody Allen, he's always trying to make it sexual, and he cannot possibly really carry it off. So for some reason, his female leads like him, but we never really know why. I think it's his sense of humor.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1931, I don't know how much eros or erotica you can show. I mean, the code comes in right about that time, but the code would allow hands touching, right? So you don't think the code?
Yeah. This production code really didn't. They didn't start enforcing it very much until about 1934. So that wasn't so much of an issue. But I would agree that the way they grab their hands, it's recognition, and he has shown such kindness to her. He hasn't been putting a move on or anything like that. He's taken with her beauty and her vulnerability, I think, and he wants to try to help her. So I mean, it's very uncommon in great American movies to have an open ending where he really where the filmmaker really throws it back to you to say, okay, what's the significance of all this that's gone on before, and what's going to happen in the relationship between these people. But the conception is quite brilliant, isn't it? That we have a blind woman who believes she's been helped by a wealthy gentleman, and she dreams of having a relationship with him. And then she discovers at the very end of the film that the person who has been so kind and so gentle and so helpful to her is not a person of wealth and power and prestige, but just a very kind person. And then what are you going to do with that? Because again, that's why I think about this movie is going back and forth between money and love. And then, as you suggest, Dan, love can actually mean a number of things. It can mean eros, but it can mean agape, or it can mean philias, kindness to another person and undying kindness to another person. That's kind of what they have shown one another. And then what's going to happen with them after the movie's over? That's the big question, I think.
So let's wrap up, and let me ask you, Jill, and then I'll go to Chuck. Is there any comments you want to make on the film that we didn't get to? Any thoughts on the legacy of the film? And then why someone who has never seen a Chaplin film, or this film in particular, should watch this because it's great. So Jill, first you.
Sure. I mean, I've been contemplating ever since you got in touch, Dan, about why the world thinks it's his best and why I don't. So I think things about the open ending that makes it very special. I also think that balance of the two stories is much better than he did on I won't say any other film because I think Limelight goes pretty well. But if you look at extraneous scenes in other film that are just there for the slapstick, you can find many of those. So there's that. It's on a lower contrast film stock than his next film, Modern Times. So it's going to depend too on whether your taste is more for something slightly more modern or not. Because Modern Times is really high contrast and sharp, sharp images.
Huh.
Which City Lights is not. But Chuck has mentioned a couple of times the music is fantastic. La Violetera has got, talking about sex, it's got that sexy Latinx backbeat on it, like a tango, like there's a rubato to it.
Mm-hmm.
And really, if you like Charlie Chaplin, you should watch this one, especially as it is his transitional film from silent to sound. Last one of the silence.
So, Chuck, what is your take on the legacy of the film? Any comments about anything we missed? And then finally, why you think someone should watch it who hasn't watched it before?
Yeah, particularly if someone doesn't know Chaplin at all, you really should see this film. George Bernard Shaw said that Chaplin was the only genius the movies have developed, and you get to see that character, that iconic tramp character, probably in its highest form, maybe in the movie. Chaplin made 8 United Artists feature films, and the last scene in City Lights and the first scene in Modern Times are the exact middle of his body of work. And I think by that time he really knew what he was doing, and he had become more ambitious as an artist to try to do even more than he had in his earlier comic films. And I think if you like to see the tramp character in this kind of richest form in a silent film with a musical score, then City Lights is a film to see. If you're more interested in how Chaplin became a more overtly political filmmaker, commenting on the Depression, then you see Modern Times. But if you're a true lover of film, you will see both of them, I think. But yeah, I think City Lights is a movie that gives you a great idea of how silent film comedy is still very accessible to viewers today, and also it takes you through a complexity of range of emotions that's sort of uncommon in silent film comedy. So those are the number of the reasons that I'd suggest. And Dan, I appreciate your suggesting that film as a possibility in your list of favorite films. So thanks for letting me get a chance to say something about it.
Well, I will link to both of your university web pages below this video. I thank you both for participating, and it was a great discussion, so thank you. City Lights for Charlie Chaplin. I have never known the outcome of their last encounter, nor need to. The truth in old familiar hands reveals more than final denouement, yet too often the blindness of the seeing is the thing which cannot be repaired with each layer of early green shed to earth. Youth is supposed to learn, then soar in eclectic bloom to life's sun, mature and natural, but callow eyes focus too often on the petty rages. The sharp neon of the system mesmers too many buds to early death. Their raw, tender flesh, once opened, rots in a soft genocide quick with experience. The dancing pulse of city lights were flute-fingered mimetics of a gentler bygone age, flitted to horizon, lost from meaning like dead tubers in permafrost. Yet the tramp, still painting lace portraits of sentimentalism to suicidal winos and spreading bright flowers from one blind girl,
in her silent black and white world, to this dun sea of blaring sightlessness, is more than a root. He is that nurse attending premature babies yet weaned from drugs or alcohol, that lawyer defending the indefensible and the accused innocent, that counselor working on doped-up kids and founded unions of love, that deathless moth made blind by heaven's pure light. He is a sunflower, a warming throng of oneness, thralled in trope to humanity and its multi-toned plight. So when someone, anyone, next holds your hand with anxious eyes and asks if you can see now, do not shrink nor turn within to eyelids uncharted, for true constellation is the jewelry of life in such queried caress.